Hello and welcome to another edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. We're back after a 2-week break, and our guest is Don Yaeger, a New York Times bestselling author and former associate editor for Sports Illustrated. He is the host of the Corporate Competitor podcast. Our host, of course, is Sri Srinivasan, Managing Director of ASU's Cronkite School of Journalism's Cronkite Pro, and co-founder of Digimentors, a digital and virtual events consultancy. My name is Neil Parekh, and I am the executive producer and guest host of the show. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. We're also live on Don's Facebook page and his Twitter account. Don, thank you so much for letting us do that. Welcome to everyone watching. Please like, please comment, please share. Please let us know where you're watching from. Tag your friends. Retweet. We want more people to see the show and to get some of the wisdom that Don will be sharing with us throughout the show. We're going to be covering a range of different topics. There are special sections. There's a special section on Afghanistan. It's 1 year since the fall of Kabul, the U.S. withdrawal. There's a major climate change story on A1. And we'll be talking about Don's career and some of the great stories that he has been involved with as well. But first, let me share with you the teaser video so you have a sense of what's coming. Our guest on this week's edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along is Don Yaeger, an 11-time New York Times best-selling author and longtime associate editor for Sports Illustrated. He is the host of the Corporate Competitor podcast, where he interviews CEOs and talks about the lessons they learned through sports. As a journalist, Don has pursued some incredible stories. He hiked through the mountains of Afghanistan with the mujahedeen as they fought the Soviets in 1988, spent a year working with the FBI on a Sports Illustrated cover story on pedophiles in youth sports, lived with football legend Walter Payton and his family for 10 weeks as Payton was dying, and interviewed Iraqi athletes tortured by Saddam Hussein's son Uday, chairman of the Iraqi Olympic Committee. Don's New York Times bestsellers include books about scandals at Notre Dame and Duke, biographies of baseball and football stars, and books on George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson. Don is currently working on a book about the Savannah Bananas baseball team. This Sunday's paper includes a New York Times Magazine cover story about Afghanistan and a special section about life in Kabul under Taliban rule, after the fall. Sri Srinivasan is our host. I am the executive producer and occasional guest host, Neil Parekh. Paula Kiger helps produce the show, engaging with the audience on Facebook and LinkedIn. Sri has been hosting the New York Times Read Along for 6.5 years, with some amazing guests. The show is produced by Digimentors. We produce high-quality virtual and hybrid events for organizations big and small around the world. We also do social and digital consulting, training, and workshops. Again, Don Yaeger is our guest, live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. Well, there's a little bit of a preview of what's to come. My first question is, how many people missed the music that we usually use with the video? We're running into a few issues with the copyright on the music. Even though it's copyright free, it's really complicated with Facebook and YouTube muting parts of the music. So we wanted to play it safe this week as those things are ironed out. But let's take a look at who is joining us, joining us so far for today's show. Miriam Berkeley is with us from Hell's Kitchen, New York. Miriam, always great to see you. And again, I want a quick shout out if you are friends with her or follow her on Facebook. Some great pictures from Hell's Kitchen in New York, particularly her puddle reflections. Check them out on Facebook. Doug Levy is joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area. Always getting up early, 5:30 a.m. Eastern time to join us. Doug, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Patricia Freudenberg is joining from New York. Patricia, thank you. Watching on LinkedIn. We're also live on LinkedIn. Our good friend Stephen Kaplan is joining us from Ramsey, New Jersey, saying hello to the New York Times Read Along family. Thank you, Stephen. And we always like to thank people for being a part of the New York Times Read Along family. Right on cue. Thank you so much. Again, we are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. And now we'll bring on our host, Sri Srinivasan. Sri, good to see you.
Good morning, Neil. Great to be with you today and to have Don as our guest. He's going to be fantastic, and I'm going to learn so much, as is everyone who's watching. Tell us how your Sunday is going, folks. If you're just getting up, or it's already the middle of the day, or into your evening. We'd love to hear from you, and also to hear your thoughts on the news. There's so much going on, and it's a sobering morning, of course, as we think about Salman Rushdie and everything that's happened since Friday. And the latest update that I saw was a note from his agent that was published widely that said that he is speaking and joking and off the ventilator. So that is good news, but overall just very, very sobering and upsetting what happened to Salman Rushdie. Today we are going to just get a quick look at the news and in the newspaper, and then we're going to bring Don on. So please tag your friends, tell anyone who would enjoy meeting Don and hearing his thoughts to join us. They can watch us live or later. There is so much news, of course, to talk about. So I'm going to...
Sri, we lost your audio, actually. So let's see what we can do with that. Sri obviously has the paper in front of him. So we might what we might need to do, take off the main camera, Sri. Let's see if that resolves it. Sri, can we hear you now? And now unmute. And we're not, Sri?
You can hear me now.
We can hear you now, yeah.
Perfect, great. Thank you. Sorry about that, folks. I just want to start by just showing you the headline here from yesterday's New York Times, the Saturday's paper. So showing what happened on Friday. Rushdie, author who spent years in hiding, is stabbed on stage. And he was stabbed in the abdomen and neck on Friday by a man who rushed the stage where he was speaking. And a young man from New Jersey has been arrested, and he pleaded not guilty. So that's yesterday's paper on the front page. The Rushdie News has a note here, and it goes into the internal section here, and it talks about the place where the attack happened. Cultural and an institution for cultural and Christian leaders for nearly 150 years. Let's take a look at the rest of the news. The lead story is Trump lawyer asserted return of secret papers was completed by June. And as you know, there were lots of classified files were still found at Mar-a-Lago. And the rights talk darkens and violence rises. And we saw that with the attack in Cincinnati and the shooting at the FBI office where the assailant was killed. And there was also in Phoenix office of the FBI, there were armed folks who showed up there. The lead, the front page also has a look at the new Exchequer Dam in California. Global warming has increased the state's chances of a megastorm to 1 in 50. And so here, the megastorm that could inundate California, a month-long downpour, is made more likely by climate change. And we will see the inside story where this is really shows you how scary things could be. They say it could be $1 trillion in loss and 5 to 10 million people displaced. Fox News Channel is on its heels amid libel suit on voter fraud, and a year since Afghanistan's fall. And we'll be talking a lot about this because our guest, Don Yaeger, has been someone who has covered Afghanistan in many different ways. And so we will be talking to him about that. And Democrats laboring to retain crucial Asian American votes. Asian Americans have traditionally been Democratic supporters, but they are being targeted for votes by Republicans. The New York Times Magazine cover, collision course after barring girls from high school and harboring Al-Qaeda leader, the Taliban government risks becoming a pariah state, jeopardizing the aid that keeps Afghans alive. And in many ways, it is a pariah state already, but it still gets aid from the US. And this is after the fall, the special section about Afghanistan and the end of the American presence there. So we will talk about that. Sunday business cover is Welcome to the Battery Belt. Commerce, Georgia is at the center of the electric vehicle revolution. And so that'll be an interesting story. And the bosses of Silicon Valley slip out of town. Lots of changes in the tech sector. And here is her changing comfort zone. A fashion pioneer is preparing to pass the torch. Will Eileen Fisher be, what'll it be? What will Eileen Fisher be without Eileen Fisher? Is the headline there. The Sunday opinion cover, even as negotiations restart over the nuclear deal, American officials still don't understand the country or its leader. And we have seen the impact of the fatwa 33 years later, and the impact on Salman Rushdie just this week. Arts and leisure cover is Winter Came and Went. House of Dragon now has its season. Those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, this was the most popular show in HBO history. Will its first spin-off win viewers back? The new spin-off takes place as a prequel a century or so before the events of Game of Thrones. And real estate covered Development Without Displacement. A city tests what's possible. And we will learn about the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington that is yet to be built, but which is being watched. And the Metropolitan section cover is Scaling Back the City's Open Streets, a pandemic program that gave New Yorkers more pedestrian-friendly spaces has retreated by 63 miles. And finally, the book cover, since we're talking to someone who's been on the New York Times book best-selling list 11 times in his 29 books, the cover is The Greatest, The Path Lit by Lightning. David Moranis explores the life of legendary athlete Jim Thorpe, and I will ask we'll talk to Don about this story as well. So with that, I think we're ready to bring on to stage our guest. He is New York Times bestselling author and former associate editor of Sports Illustrated and the host of the Corporate Competitor podcast, Don Yaeger.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Look forward to joining.
And Sri, sorry, we're gonna have to take your camera off and then put it back on again. See if that fixes the audio. Something about having the camera and your computer camera on at the same time. It's not happy. There we go. That's better.
Yeah, Don,
Great.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Technology is a beautiful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's always better when it's somebody else dealing with it.
Well, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Our first question always is, how are you? Where are you? And how have you been these last 2 crazy years?
Well, I'm in Tallahassee, Florida. Actually, I came downtown to my office to do this. It had the best setup for what we might be able to do. And we're doing great. Got a lot of, it is fun that many of the things that we were excited about doing pre-pandemic, writing regularly, speaking to audiences, doing the podcast, all are kind of in full flow right now, which is great. And as for the last 2 years, so I was an early adopter. I got COVID before COVID was cool. I got it back in June of 2020 when, frankly, my wife and I were the first 2 people that we knew that even had gotten COVID, and we were the test babies. We ended up, both of us, she got some sick. I ended up 9 days in the ICU. So It was a pretty rough run of it. I learned early to respect um, the infection, and but um, we're feeling very good now.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. And being the first in this particular case must have been so upsetting for the rest of your family because you didn't know what was happening and there was such little information.
It was that. Then that was one of the great challenges, is that even doctors were saying, we're going to try this, but
Mm.
I mean, everything was an attempt at just, it was best effort, and we got it. And fortunately, we had great doctors who worked through it. But yeah, there were several days there in that quarter in that room, when you just weren't sure what was next.
Wow, that's that's so upsetting to think about, but we're so glad everything worked out. As we know, the pandemic is not over, and we're hearing about a lot of people who are getting sick in recent days. People who are vaccinated and boosted and everything. So, folks, please stay safe when you're out there. Here's Patricia saying, "Oh my goodness, amazing grace for your COVID recovery."
It was amazing, Grace.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your work, and you do so many different things. Where would you like to go first? Maybe the podcast?
Sure. I love talking about it's kind of it is my it's a high energy point of our current model, things that we're doing, things that we're working, ways that we're engaging with the world. And so love the way it's growing. And um, it I'll share with you that the concept is, in my years since I retired from Sports Illustrated, um, many of my opportunities out into the world have been not just writing books, but then also speaking, as I mentioned earlier, into corporate events. So I've always been fascinated by how can we teach great lessons uh, about into your business life, but from a sporting perspective. What can they teach us? So it happened that couple 3 years ago, I saw an article in ESPN that referenced an Ernst and Young study that noted that they had done research to try to figure out what's the most common denominator between women who were on the C-suite, the executive suite of Fortune 500 companies. And what they found was that the answer was sports. They had participated in sports. The number was off the charts. 94% of the women who were on the C-suite of these Fortune 500 companies had played sports, 52% of them in college. And so I thought, how great would it be to interview those women or those people who had experienced sports as a training ground, if you will, and being able to bring their stories to life and actually and get the lessons they learned that help them become better leaders later. So the pandemic happens. Speaking is no longer on the radar screen. Everybody's shutting down their events, and we decided to start a podcast, mostly because I thought the world needed one more podcast. And we started interviewing executives, both men and women, who played sports and how sports made them better leaders. And so that was the original kind of premise. And just Friday, I interviewed Dan Cathy, the CEO of Chick-fil-A. What an incredible man, but also in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, because he was so good as a wrestler in high school and college. So these lessons from sports become are central to our conversation about what they can teach.
So here we're looking at some of the folks that you've interviewed. Here you interviewed Condoleezza Rice, who is in the C-suite, was in the C-suite, of course, in multiple ways, including at the White House. What are some of the lessons that they learned playing sports that made them good business leaders?
One of the things that Condoleezza Rice shared was that she learned early that that the great teams have an identity, right? They don't change every you can count on this team to be they're gonna bring this to you, whether it's again in football, and she's a huge football fan. She's the daughter of a high school football coach. She tells amazing stories about the idea that her father used to have her on the sidelines, and she would look up as early as 6 years old and tell him what play the other team was getting ready to run based on their formation. So she just loves the games. She also was a pretty good ice skater and is an amazing golfer. The first woman ever asked to join Augusta National, the home of the Masters. So she's got so many lessons that taught her. But for her, a big piece of it was, as she studies and looks at teams, how much of what she looks at is the idea that team has a go-to strength. They're not, and that's what she believes should be true of our businesses, of our nations. That you need to be able to look at us and say, this is what you should expect. Now, might they surprise you? Of course. But she also was really great talking about how she used sports in her executive career and her knowledge of sports in her executive career to break down barriers with other groups, of many of whom were men, in environments where she was working, and that sports became kind of her language that allowed her to just enter conversations she might not have been able to do before.
You've done a nice job here, by the way, of breaking out the podcast for people who may not have time to read everything. They can, she says, lessons learned from being terrible at figure skating, for example. And she had expressed interest in being football commissioner of the NFL, right? That was something that was part of her interest. So who are some of the other people you've had?
So we've also had Carla Vernon, one of my all-time favorites. Carla is vice president of consumables, a $50 billion vertical within Amazon. And I loved it. Carla and I served together on the national board of Make-A-Wish, which is my favorite charity. And so we're on the national board of Make-A-Wish together. I'm beginning the podcast. I reached out to Carla. I said, I'm looking for people who were athletes. Were you an athlete? And she said, I danced competitively at Princeton, right? And I said, well, I'm looking for athletes. That didn't go over very well. Carla made sure that I understood how athletic dancers had to be, and we ended up into an incredibly engaging conversation about what being part of a team, even in that environment, taught her that she's been able to use in so many of her executive roles over the years. She was a senior level executive at General Mills prior to Amazon. She is but the things that she learned through her participation in sports gave her a sense of self-confidence, because she had practiced she'd spent even her childhood doing her thing in front of other people. Really, really incredible.
It's great insight, folks. We're talking to Don Yaeger, who's telling us about his amazing podcast, but we're going to also talk about his book. So let's get to that. You've had an incredible career as an author, 29 books, 11 of them have been on the New York Times bestseller list. Tell us about some of the books, and we'll see some of them here on the screen.
I had the chance. One of the books that was up there just now was to work with Walter Payton. I grew up a huge Walter Payton fan, as many did probably from my generation. And one of the things that stood out to me about Walter was, that he just was always the best prepared, the best physical condition, like everything you would want in an athlete, he was bringing to the game consistently. And so I was surprised while I'd met Walter several times, got to know him a little bit, I was surprised to learn on a TV show one morning that Walter had announced to the world that he had a very rare form of liver cancer, and it was so rare and so difficult that he was asking the public to give him space, to not come bother him. Not what a what an amazing thing to see at 46 years old, one of the greatest athletes I'd ever even imagined seeing, suddenly confessing that he had no idea what his future looked like, and he asked the world to give him space. As it happened, a few weeks later, I was in Chicago to be on Oprah Winfrey's show for a story that I had written, and the next day I got a phone call, and it was from Walter Payton, and he had seen me on Oprah's show, and he wanted to know if I might help him write his book. And it was a powerful experience to get a chance to. He was my hero, as I said. Somebody I would have given in any other circumstance, anything you could ask for time in his presence, and now the time I was going to get was going to be the last few weeks of his life. So the opportunity to be trusted by Walter and by his family to tell that story, knowing that Walter would never actually get a chance to read it, was a game changer for me in my professional career. Walter's choice of me as his writer opened the doors for me to write with many, many other athletes who immediately said, "If Walter Payton trusts you, I trust you."
Right. What a story. I'm curious, what was that Oprah story appearance? You said it was because of a story you wrote.
So you've got it right there on the screen. I had done a story about athletes, or excuse me, about I'd worked with the FBI for a number of months, and a fellow colleague of mine, Bill Knack, and I spent a year studying mostly men who had gotten into youth sports, either as coaches or umpires, because in the interaction we were able to see through these Times documents, or through these FBI documents, that the pedophiles realized that the youth sports were the quote last great candy store of opportunity, that schools were doing background checks to find out if you had ever been arrested for things. You couldn't get a bus driver job. You couldn't work at a youth center anymore. But sports, nobody was background checking coaches back then. And so we actually went into prisons to sit down with men who had been convicted multiple times for molesting and abusing young athletes, and they explained to us that it was their, in their mind, it was in their DNA, that just as many others might head to a bar on a Friday night looking for a date with somebody, they went to a youth field to do the exact same thing. And it was as sick and as disgusting as it is to imagine when Neil, for example, asked me about what I considered the biggest story I did at Sports Illustrated. I said, this is disgusting, but this is because out of this story, multiple shows did stories about it. 31 states ultimately changed their laws in some way to raise the bar of background check around youth coaching. And so while it may not be the most pleasant of topics, in fact, it may be, I can't imagine a less pleasant topic. It's an opportunity. It was an opportunity as a journalist to really look back at the end of my career and say, there was a place where we made a difference.
Don and Sri, if you don't mind, I stepped in for just a moment. I mentioned to Don when we spoke, and he mentioned this story that, that this is something that we've discussed on this show. on the New York Times read along. Folks might remember we've had several guests who have been advocates. Abigail Pesta, for one, who wrote a book about the women gymnasts at Michigan. We had Rosemary Aquilina, Judge Aquilina, who sentenced the doctor involved in that. We've had a colleague of mine, Dawn Helmrich, who organized this event called Denim Day for survivors of sexual assault. We've had her on the show twice. Don, I didn't mention this earlier, but this is something that I'm just going to take a moment and say, because we do need to talk more about this. I also did a special show during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings when this was in the air, and shared with this audience that I too was abused as a child by a neighbor. So this really speaks to me, and I'm really glad that you brought this up. And for folks that are watching that are not familiar with the story, we'll find a link and you can watch it. I've talked about it publicly a little bit. So I don't want to just drop it and run, but at the same time, I do want to be able to just mention it and say that I'm a survivor, to get it out there so that it's a little bit normalized and a little bit, something that we can talk about. It doesn't have to take over the whole show. It's just something that happened, and people need to know that it happens to little boys as well.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I have to tell you, one of the things, my wife and I have talked about this multiple times, that again, most grateful for out of all of this is that several of the young boys who I was the first person outside of their family they had ever told the story to, we stay in touch today, right? We just sent off gifts a few months ago for one of their weddings up in Massachusetts. I was on the phone not long ago with one of them who was a state trooper in North Dakota. This has been years, as you can tell, but it was an opportunity to engage people where they were, and it was not. It was one of the most difficult things you could ever do. I cried a lot while working on that story.
Thank you, Neil, for sharing that again and reminding us of your bravery in speaking out. And so many of the people that we've talked to who've been on this show, who have worked with survivors, they talk about the bravery of the survivors, including those athletes that Abigail Pesta interviewed, the victims of Larry Nassar. Chitachi says, this critically important work, thank you for sharing this. And Chitachi, thank you for watching from Fort Lauderdale, as you always do. We really appreciate you, and everyone check out her amazing work online, including her Instagram lives. Let's talk about some of your other stories as well. This is for change of pace, but again, connected to sports. This is about son of Saddam, about Uday Hussein. And as Iraq's top Olympic official, he had a role to play in the mistreatment and abuse of athletes.
Yeah. So it just prior to the United States and the global forces making their invasion of Iraq in 2003, one of the things that we'd learned, and then one of the beauties of working at a place like Sports Illustrated and just what an incredible time and venue it was when amazing ideas came in, we were not afraid to go figure out whatever the budget was. Let's go tackle it. And so one of the things we had heard was that we did know, everyone knew, that Saddam Hussein's son Uday was chairman of the Iraqi Olympic Committee. What we had heard but had not been able to prove was that while he was in that role, he actually built into the basement of the Iraqi Olympic Committee building a 31-cell torture chamber. And his model for leadership was, Sri, you look like you're, I tell you, watching the way you're running these days, when you go to the Pan Asian Games, I don't think you should finish any worse than second. So don't come back with anything less than a silver. right? Now imagine you go and you run and you finish with a bronze. What you know is on the other side of your return trip is a visit to the basement where they had all sorts of torture machines that they used depending on what they were trying to make sure you understood as the importance of your role as an athlete wearing the Iraq colors. Well, in order to report that story, I had to travel to London, to Lebanon, to several other places where former Iraqi athletes had expatriated. You know, when they knew they were going to get tortured, or even after they had been tortured, the next time they were on an international trip, they skipped out on the team, and I tracked them down. Many of them showed me their scars. They told me their stories, and we ran this story about the son of Saddam. Kind of the flip side to this is that a year later, right, shortly after this story ran, the invasion of Iraq had begun, and one of the buildings that was bombed was the Iraqi Olympic Committee building. One of the early targets that was killed was Uday Hussein. So now Iraq's Olympic Committee has a new leader. They have a new plan to try to get ready for the 2004 Olympics in Athens. And I was invited to travel to Iraq and to spend time with these Iraqi athletes, training for the first time, to training freely for the first time to prepare for an athletic competition. Part of my visit included a trip down to that torture chamber, which was still, most of it remained, and you could still see remnants of that, of what he had, the torture he had meted out as his leadership model. And it was, for me, it was one of those places where you can go full circle on a story, and you get to see not just the telling of it, but also obviously in the telling of it, I could never have gone into that torture chamber because Iraq was still controlled at the time by Saddam.
Patricia has the one-word response, I think a lot of us do, which is wow. Folks, this is Don Yaeger. We're talking to him on the New York Times read-along. We do this every Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. He's a New York Times best-selling author of 11 books that hit the bestseller list, but he's at 29. He's also a podcaster whose podcast talks to C-suite and other leaders about what they learned from high school and college sports, and that's Corporate Competitor is the name of the podcast. And we want to show at least one more story if we can, that your adventures in Afghanistan are something that you wouldn't expect most folks to be able to do, most journalists, American journalists, to be able to cover.
Yeah, this goes way back. This is the how old are you portion of this session. But
you still have your hair, Don. That's the important thing.
Yeah, it's good, and no dye at all in any of it, which is good.
Impressive.
Yeah. So 1988. Think about how crazy that is. 1988. I am just a few years out of college, and I was working for a newspaper in Jacksonville, Florida, the Florida Times-Union. And one of the things I loved about this paper was it was part of a chain of papers that would make investments in crazy stories if you were willing to lay out a really good model for why it would be unique. No one else could probably gather it. As I learned in that time, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the intellectual elite of the country, as often happens, fled, right? They left because they had the resources to be able to leave. And the number one place that most Afghans fled to was Detroit. For whatever reason, the number two place was Jacksonville, Florida. So this town where I'm writing as a journalist for, I'm the political editor of the newspaper, is the host city for this large burgeoning population of Afghan elites. But what I also learned was that out of a sense of requirement, like we left the country while they stayed to fight the Soviets, as part of their give back, there were a series of Afghan doctors who would go back to Iraq, back to Afghanistan. Excuse me, I keep saying Iraq. Back to Afghanistan to actually spend a certain number of weeks on the battlefield treating the injuries of Afghan mujahedeen who were injured by the Soviets. And so I asked one of these doctors if they would ever allow a journalist to flow along with them for the trip, and he thought that was crazy. I mean, there were lots of people who lost their lives in these. This wasn't as if you're entering with, a battalion of American soldiers, right? You're entering with a bunch of 12-year-old boys who happen to have Kalashnikovs, right? So we got permission and we made the trip. You flew into Pakistan. One of the things that was important was in Pakistan, you went to the U.S. Embassy and you gave up your passport, because if you were captured in country in Afghanistan, the United States didn't want people to be able to immediately identify you, because we were not supposed to have U.S. citizens in the country. So give up your passport, make your way through then you walk the Khyber Pass, and then you begin the mission that the mujahedeen you were traveling with came there to execute. A photographer, great friend, John Pemberton, and I ended up in country there for weeks. We ended up reporting a special section about Russia's losing war, because at that stage Russia was just a couple of years away from actually taking themselves out of the country, withdrawing, and in that process, we were able to explain what the damage Russia had left behind, the many people who would be affected for many, many years by the butterfly mines that the Russians had spread throughout the country, when they took down a Russian helicopter with an American Stinger missile, which we were providing them. Some of you might remember that was the real turning point in that war. But I got to experience the resilience of the Afghan people, and I got to see why an occupying force, an occupying nation, will always be in a struggle, in a difficult position with those very proud people.
We just saw a note from Sachin who says, "I remember reading that story when it first came out," which is
Sachin. What that means is that you're as old as me, and that's you and I are just lucky to be up on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. Folks, we're going to continue our conversation with Don. If you have any questions for him, please post, and please share this with your friends. You can tag them. You can hit reshare, retweet. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and on our digimentors.group website. So please do share, and people can watch live or later. And as soon as we're off the air at 10 a.m. Eastern, this entire show will rerun and will be available in the archive version. There was a question we got here from Patricia, who says, "What advice do you give a new reporter abroad in a hostile environment?"
I would tell you, I think the greatest advice is a recognition that it is you can't count on anyone else to protect you. Your need to be vigilant in all things and always have your eyes on everything going around you. What is that backpack over there? Why did that person come, leave, and what did they leave behind? Everything. It it was a great wake up call for me on uh, how wonderfully we live our life in our country, how little we pay attention to in because we don't really anticipate that many people could have a different opinion of you and what you're doing, and want to be able to act out on it. So I think my greatest lesson was it put antenna everywhere for me in everything that I did. And it probably made me, in that sense, a better journalist, even in non-confrontational situations, because I suddenly did pay greater attention to so many other things going on around me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I do want to instead of going to the front page of the New York Times, there are two stories here in the magazine and here about Afghanistan, and just wanted to kind of flip through the pages with you and kind of hear your thoughts as we're going through this. I know you've got the print edition there with you.
I do.
Yeah, of both the magazine and this. And so this is about how August 15, 2021 was the day that the Taliban took over and they seized the capital of Kabul, and the lives of Afghans, whether they fled abroad or were left behind, has been irrevocably upended. And that sounds so familiar to that story that you did and that work that you did in 1988. So let's just look through the section. And if you have any observations, thoughts, anything that just catches your eye, comments, please jump in. And it's hard to believe a year has already passed after the fall of Kabul.
It is. I have to tell you, I think the thing that really stood out to me, and I was trying to explain this to my own children, a year ago, was that, when we were, when John Pemberton and I were embedded with the mujahedeen, they were our friends, right? And some of those very same mujahedeen became our enemies, and so the changing dynamic of geopolitical, opportunity, and the way we interact with a country, who we leave behind, how we treat even those that are not on our side, if you will, is one of those things that I don't know that any country, and certainly I'm certain I do believe it's true of our government, that I don't think that we have always been as masterful as we should be. We identify an ally within an organization or within a country. We give all resources to that ally, but who knows if that's the ally that survives.
And of course, America's own machinations over the years in interference and worse in various world affairs and internal affairs of other countries has come back.
It eliminates our moral high ground.
Yeah, exactly. Here's an interesting part of this. Day by day, a new life dawns. The Times secured evacuations of hundreds of Afghans. The women among them slowly came to know the freedoms of their new homes. And so just very interesting to see women in Texas and other places as they are trying to adjust to their new life. And it was good that the Times and so many other private organizations were also able to evacuate Afghans. And of course, so many of them, including Americans, didn't make it out. And here is in the aftermath of a suicide bombing in Kabul, the Kabul airport. You're just seeing these images. Some of them would be familiar to you, right, from your time there 30 years ago.
I'm so glad to know that the Times made that investment to help those that had some connection in any way to their coverage, or whatever other reasons it might be, to help them leave that environment. That is, people don't realize that when I was when I went back into Iraq to actually travel with the Olympic Committee team that was there, one of the one of the things that happened was that there were several translators who worked for the U.S. government that helped us as journalists do our job, and in that situation, the translators were putting themselves at risk. And in fact, one night while we were there working on that story, word immediately filtered out that one of the translators had been executed. Somebody had come up from behind him and killed him for working with Americans, even though they were Americans like me that were there to help tell the story of what was happening in country. The idea that he lost his life for helping us it was amazing to me.
So how upsetting to think about that. And Americans did the same thing in Iraq with local Iraqi translators, but not all of them made it out. Here are where Afghan evacuees are resettled. You can see all over the country, and that's good to see. And there's an essay by a New York Times reporter who joined in Kabul in 2016, and then he was evacuated last year, Fahim Abed, and he was a guest on our COVID-19 related show about covering during the pandemic, and he talked about how tough life was there and has been here adjusting in the United States. Adrift in a new life, mourning the old one, and so much more to read here. And this is that very stunning two-page cover of the section. I feel like I live in a different country now. It's not my country anymore, says Miriam, who's in Kabul, a former journalist who later worked in a ministry in Afghanistan, and the plight of the women especially hard to deal with. Let's also look at the Times Magazine collision course. After barring girls from high school and harboring an al-Qaeda leader, the Taliban government risks becoming a pariah state, jeopardizing the aid that keeps Afghans alive. And the really important story that we'll just take a quick look at. There are a couple of other Afghanistan-related stories in here, including the students who came here and have been studying. But here's that collision course story, and looking at life in hospitals. And what do you remember about the plight of women during the mujahedeen days? I'm sure it wasn't as much of focus as it is now.
Well, again, my traveling, my work was with a group of fighters. So I entered the country with this group of fighters, and we walked in, went to the place that we were, that the assignment that we were given to try to take on, and all of those fighters were men. All of the or young boys. It was amazing. 12-year-old boys carrying weapons consistently. The only time we interacted with women was at mealtime, and at mealtime it was just in the preparation and service. So the men ate separately, and again, there was much about it culturally that was you couldn't even compare it to anything that we might have imagined living in our society. But it was certainly I was there to kind of chronicle the war, the battle, the fight, and I didn't get as deeply into the subject of women and the treatment of as I would have liked if I had stayed longer.
Sure. I mean, you were in the middle of a war, so that becomes the priority, the coverage. Here you're seeing in their first year at U.S. universities, Afghan women refugees have fought to keep their heads in campus life while their hearts are still at home. So that's
I have to tell you, I've got a really close friend, George Shin, and his wife are doing a lot of work in Nashville, and I don't think I fully appreciated it till I saw that map with all the size, the dots there of how many Afghan refugees are making their way into certain communities and what those communities are doing to help integrate those those refugees into U.S. schooling, U.S. And so it's amazing what some of our 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 non-government organizations are doing to help in those transitions. And so praise to all of those folks who are doing it.
You hear a lot about Ivy League and other schools that take on these refugees, but they're also all over the country, as we saw. And at Arizona State, where I teach, the situation was a little more settled. The women who already had undergraduate degrees were given the option of pursuing a master's. The rest were invited to stay until they could complete their undergraduate degrees. So people coming together all over the country to make this happen. We're just looking at all the puzzles in the paper. Are you a puzzler, crossword puzzle, or Wordle, or any of those?
I am not, though my son is. He's I think he has a future far greater than mine. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Here's the famous puzzle, the Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle. Let's look at the rest of the paper, folks. We have about another 25 minutes or so with Don Yaeger. Please check him out online and all his amazing work at Don Yaeger on social and his website as well. Hi, Neil.
Sri, just a quick question for Don. Don, you mentioned your friend George from Nashville. Is this the organization that he?
It is yes, it is, and boy, they are the impact that they are. They're engaging. Boy, what I don't think I had fully appreciated or thought until he and I were recently speaking about what it's going to take, and about this about the idea that many of these children have come here with what they had on their backs. That's not what they want to be able to wear to school when school starts next week. So how do we help them in the assimilation process? And so, yeah, really, really powerful. And I was honored that he shared with me all that they were working on and that he was working on to be helpful there.
Shout out to our producer Paula Kiger, who found that link and checked to see whether that was the right page. So well done,
Paula. You're constantly awesome.
That. Appreciate that.
TennesseeResettlementAid.org. Everyone do check it out. And Mary C. Curtis, former guest on the show, says, enjoying the conversation from Charlotte, North Carolina about this important anniversary. Back home after time on the road with my role called political column writing. Please check her out, MC Curtis NC3. Mary, thank you for all your work. Let's look at the rest of the paper. The front page lead story is about how a Trump lawyer said that all the secret papers had been returned by June, but of course during the raid this week in Mar-a-Lago, many were found. And everyone knows that California is under threat of a major catastrophe. We always, that it might happen in the next decades, and we always think it's a big earthquake, but now they're saying it also could be a megastorm. A month-long downpour is made more likely by climate change. And you're looking at the New Exchequer Dam in California, and this increased the state's chances of a megastorm to 1 in 50. And it could cause unprecedented devastation of life as well as property all over California. And this is new research that has just come out. Fox is on its heels amid libel suit on voter fraud that people know about this company, which it targeted Dominion Voting Systems, is now targeting Fox. And Democrats laboring to retain crucial Asian American votes. And here's a pointer to the two big stories on Afghanistan. So I know you'll all find it interesting if you can get access to it. Inside the New York Times, a theme of hope in Anacostia. And this day in history, music is loser is 2,426 flail muse in weird Obits Field cacophony. Obits Field, which of course Don knows as a sports journalist. This is an unusual story. In August 14, 1951, free admission was offered to a Brooklyn Dodgers Boston Braves baseball game for anyone with an instrument. 2,400 fans tooted, fiddled, banged, boomed, squeaked, tinkled, and clanged in the stadium. The Times wrote, "The Braves lost, but the real loser was music, which took on an incalculable beating." Have you heard of this?
I have heard the story. Yes, there was a kind of a funny, the next level of that was when the White Sox actually decided that they wanted to kill disco, and so they told people they could bring albums and things to throw on the field, and it turned into a disaster. So I think every time baseball teams, short of our Savannah Bananas, which I hope we still talk about,
Yes.
every time they choose to wander too far away from the idea of baseball, yes, the story kind of moves on and becomes its own, takes on a life of its own.
And this tells you how long ago it was that there were the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Boston Braves. For those of you who follow baseball now, know it's the LA Dodgers and the Atlanta Braves. To uplift cocoa workers, Ivory Coast tries to reap the riches of chocolate. This is about the Ivory Coast, which is the world's top cocoa producer. But its chocolate is made abroad, not raw cocoa, which yields the most revenue. So they're trying to do more in country. And Egypt's revolving prison door, hundreds set free as leader eases grip. And we forget that there's a war in Ukraine still going on, and
Isn't that sad?
Yeah, it really is. And we see that there's still people dying every day. Al-Qaeda has not regrouped, the U.S. says, but terrorist experts call it the most positive outlook. We do know that al-Zawahiri was living in Kabul and was killed just a few days ago. Mastering a game, starting a new life at 8 years old. A flair for chess helps refugee adapt to the UK. So this is about a Ukrainian refugee using sports, as you see there, Don. Interesting story. And as U.S. weighs Guantanamo options, Saudi center may offer a solution. And survivors of India's 1947 partition turned to a YouTube channel to get closure. And this is a story out of Pakistan about the partition of India and Pakistan, India into Pakistan, and then East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh. And so August 14th and 15th are the anniversaries of the independence of those two countries. Always amusing, Don, to see here Wall Street Journal wine ads in the New York Times. Are you a wine drinker?
I'm not, but I'm a wine buyer. My wife loves it, and so yes, we are constantly in search of the great next bottle.
Wow. Okay. Tangle saga in Aspen pits rich developer versus local newspaper. So newspapers, we always say, please support your local newspaper. We talk a lot about the New York Times here, but please support a local newspaper anywhere you are in the world. Staff quit after owners of the Aspen Times did not let it cover a libel suit. And so please support the independent press. When will Pelosi retire? Who will replace her? How dare you ask? This is about the ages of many candidates in both parties who are older than some of their constituents would.
When I saw that, what stood out to me was that I didn't know who was older, the statue or Nancy Pelosi.
Here is the coming California megastorm. This is a special section with augmented reality that you can get with a QR code. So this should be really interesting. And this is talking about the increasing chances of a month-long downpour that would ravage the state. Of course, California is in constant drought now. So when you hear, 16 inches of rain, that sounds, maybe that should be a good thing, but we know how problematic it is. And this effort at telling the story, hold on, sorry about that. Here is more about the coming megastorm. And it's a story by Raymond Zong, pictures by Aaron Schaff, and design by Andrea Zagata. Again, the power of a newspaper, Don, to tell a story.
I love it, and unfortunately, and I love that you are with the read along here is with the Times. The shame is that in my lifetime and yours, Sri, we've lost dozens of other papers who used to make commitments like this to stories like that, and so it is a sad reality that we have that there's not that many places we can go anymore. It's the reason why even in Tallahassee, Florida, I'm a subscriber to the Weekend Times.
You're very right, and of course, one of the issues around that has been that foreign coverage has been left to the AP, the New York Times, Washington Post. But as you said, even your paper was able to send you as part of the chain to go and cover. There was a time when the Baltimore Sun won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the independence of India, the partition of India, if you can believe it. Like, it was just a different time and the power that newspapers had. Here's a whole page on Salman Rushdie. And the update, as many of you will have heard already, is that he's off the ventilator, and that he's talking and joking. His agent Andrew Wiley said yesterday. So that was good to see that. But here are a full page of stories. The author has 10 wounds, prosecutors say, and this is about the Chautauqua institution at the Hall of Philosophy where he was speaking. And I have friends, including my dear pal Andrew Lee, who has spoken at this venue. And it's just, Don, from all your speaking, you travel and people come out to see you, and that's part of why you do it, right? That connection that you make. And someone who had been under threat for 30 years, he had been out and about in so many ways. I've hosted him at events, and it's just very sad what's happened, but we're hoping he'll pull through. And this was people forget that even while he was in hiding, lots of terrible things happened. His translator in Japan into Japanese was killed in 1991. And there were other assaults as well. The Norwegian publisher of the Satanic Verses was shot 3 times outside his home in Oslo. He made a full recovery and then went on to reprint the book in defiance, this says. So just reverberations across the decades. And this is the Obits section. Tell me about your relationship with Obits.
It was my first job coming out of college. I think every journalist has that responsibility. You take on obituaries, and it was a mixture at the newspaper I was working for in San Antonio, Texas, between writing obituaries and covering the police beat. So often the two things intersected, but it was one of those things that that I think every journalist should have to do. The idea of actually having to work with someone's family to be able to properly tell their story and do the interviews that aren't where you're not just surface level is really an important gift.
Rose is reminding us, subscribe to local newspapers, so important. And she's at Rose Horowitz 31, watching from Connecticut. And here's a question. Have you ever written an advanced obit?
So yes, we did a couple when I was in San Antonio. We had a handful where you were trying to figure out like who might be on a near term window. Unfortunately, ironically, a couple of the ones that I wrote it felt like they never ran. The people just kept hanging on. But you would, again, there were lots of rooms there, but one of them was for H. Ross Perot, because at the time we just kept thinking that another was for a real big real estate guy there named Clinton Mangus. And I remember just doing all the work for words that didn't appear when I still worked at the newspaper. I was long gone by the time either one of those been passed.
The art of the advance obituary is something we've talked about with many of our obit writers who've been guests on the show, including Amy Padnani, who was obituary editor at the Times. And we've seen cases where people who wrote the advanced obits, they died, and their reporting and byline show up in the obit of the person who survived them. And,
wow. I don't think I quite thought through it that way, but that's pretty. That's pretty powerful.
Yep. And look at this story. Gary Schroen, 80, who led CIA team in hunt for bin Laden into Afghanistan. He went in just weeks after the September 11th attacks. He led the first team of agents into Afghanistan, and then he died one day after Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed. So he spent the last 20 years of his life thinking about getting Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda leadership, and it's sort of that chapter closed the day before he died. And Paul Cocker, cartoonist who mocked cliches at Mad Magazine, is dead at 93. Were you a Mad reader?
I was, and you can look at that picture and you can see exactly what every cartoonist office looked like that I ever worked with.
Yep. And some journalists too. Some reporters and editors also had offices like that. Here is a look at sports section. We sometimes skip the sports because we have international readers and some American sports don't translate, but it's always interesting to read about women's sports in America. And we're also in the anniversary year of Title IX. And this is about the WNBA.
Yes. And probably one of the greatest players ever in team sports, Sue Bird. I think she's an amazing, her ability to kind of stay relevant, stay active, and make other people better is, she's worthy of every inch the New York Times gives her.
Yeah, there was a full page there. Today you can walk around like you own the place. This is about the Green Bay Packers, who are famously owned by the people of the city.
Yeah, I'm actually one of their owners.
Is that right? So you have a tiny percentage, right?
I have a certificate that they sent me for whatever it was. So yes.
So that gives you right to buy a ticket. Is that correct? Or
no?
No.
And
that's right. There are no dividends. You have a share, but you don't get any dividends. You wouldn't be happy if any other company did that to you.
Right.
And the World Junior Tournament plays at a largely empty arena because of sexual assault revelations dim the shine of Canada's national game. And here are some stories, including the Afghan story and then abuse in athletics that you've covered for decades. And we're seeing that it's still a problem. What do you say can be done, or what do you think can be done to reduce these issues?
Unfortunately, I don't think I don't think there's anything that can be done, because I think human nature says there will always be some people who will be willing to be deviant. I think what we experienced with Neil on the call earlier, and I think what I experienced with the young people who were willing to step in and talk to me, is that what we have to do is open the door for conversation. People have to be able to speak about it without feeling a sense of judgment. And when we are able to do that, when we are able to kind of create those spaces where people can then that kind of behavior becomes a little harder to hide, because what allows it to flourish is the idea that so many people don't talk about it.
Thank you, Don. That's a great point. I will mention that we are working with someone based out of Milwaukee. Her name is Candace Sanchez. She has a podcast, and for the last 2 years, she's run a podcast on unspoken conversations, things that people are uncomfortable speaking about. And when I spoke at a forum for survivors of sexual abuse, I mentioned that we need to have more men have space to tell their stories. And so she's going to be devoting the 3rd season of her podcast just for male survivors to share their stories. And Digimentors is going to help produce the season for her and put it online and make it more of a video presentation. So
that's a contribution by your team. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to jump in. A good friend of ours, Sunny Slaughter, is watching on Facebook. She mentioned she gave a shout out when Sue Bird we were talking about Sue Bird, and she also mentioned there were some powerful stories. I'm not sure why we're not seeing her name and face on the screen, but I did check the comments and I saw it was Sunny, so I wanted to give her a shout out because she's such a good friend of the show and has been so supportive of the work that we are doing. And of course, she goes, Neil, I'm so proud of you. She must have just heard about the podcast that we're going to be working on. So thank you. And one last comment this is Sunny Slaughter, a good friend of ours. Everyone watching on Facebook can see her name and face, but for some reason, it's the one person whose name and face isn't coming through on StreamYard. So I wanted to give her a shout out. Back to you, Sri.
Thank you, Neil. We're going to look at the book review, and by chance, the cover of the book review is about sports.
Guy. Yeah.
And this is David Moranis explores the life of the legendary athlete Jim Thorpe, who he calls the greatest. So for people not familiar, maybe you could give us a little background on Jim Thorpe.
Well, Thorpe was an American Indian athlete who could do anything. Literally, there was no sport it did not feel he could master, and yet, because of time and place, and because of his Indian status, he didn't ever get the honor or accolades that anyone who would have achieved what he achieved would have received in any other time. I love that David, who is one of my all-time favorite writers, took on this topic, because these are hard books to do, having worked on and tried a few. But the idea that he has dug in for us, I have not read the book. I didn't even get a chance this morning to read the review, but I promise if David wrote it and it's on a topic that would require his level of talent, I cannot wait to read it.
And what a great title too. Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe. And Keith Oberman's review ends this way. Given the precision with which Moranis measures the almost unbearable weight of the odds against Thorpe, the reader begins to question if the qualifiers were actually unnecessary and if Thorpe isn't simply the greatest athlete, full stop. And this is a photo of him in 1912 when he won 2 golds at the Stockholm Olympics. Part of it was that I think he was stripped of his titles, of his medals, and then they were put back just very recently. That was an update on that story. And tell me a little bit, we're looking at the bestseller list. I'm just going to read the top 5 names here. Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. Verity by Colleen Hoover. Wow, 2 titles at number 2 and 3. Ugly Love by Colleen. What? 3 titles. Do you know about this? What's going on?
I do not. So I have to admit that one of my weaknesses is I don't read a lot of fiction. I'm in the nonfiction world, and there's just so much that I'm constantly trying to stay abreast of that I don't often read a lot of nonfiction. But my gosh, look at Colleen Hoover. I mean,
I have 3 books. Yeah, that's incredible.
And with different publishers too, Atria and Grand Central.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to say I don't know the name or the work. So
I don't. But
yeah.
We'll have to check it out.
Yeah, here's a nonfiction cover. The top 5: The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. The Big Lie by Jonathan Lemieux.
I mean, anyone that has not had the chance to read it. I mean, there's a reason why it in its own right has nearly 2 years worth of time spent on this list of top 10, right, or top 15.
Yeah, top 10,
it's hard to do for anyone that's to have 100 weeks of the New York Times in anything ever is hard to do. So quite impressive.
So now let's talk about your thoughts on being on the bestseller list. You've been there 11 times.
Honestly, if you had asked me at the beginning of a writing career what I would do to ever have a New York Times bestseller, I would have laughed. I mean, I probably didn't believe in worthiness, but I'm blessed that now 11 different books have made that list, and collectively over 100 and something weeks of time on the list. It is the gold standard. Unfortunately, the bestseller list phrasing has been cheapened, and I'm not gonna overly criticize Amazon because they sell a lot of my books, but the idea that for 1 hour in one little subcategory of something, you could be a #1 bestseller, and there's so many people out there claiming it, right? I'm a best-selling author because they had that 1 hour. It cheapens what it takes and the difficulty of achieving what what Colleen Hoover and others have done right here. It's a hard thing to do to make this list, and I think it's why it is the gold standard. It's why all of us who spend our career writing hope just to wake up on a Sunday morning and see your name there.
And here's an unusual story: the Old Men and the Sea, the annual gathering of Hemingway lookalikes.
I love that.
It is in Key West, of course. It has to be in Key West.
Yeah.
All right.
But I will tell you, I own every book review, every copy of this magazine that I have had a New York Times bestseller. Oh my gosh, look at this. Marian Martinez is just checked in. So Adrian, her son, was one of those who shared with me in this story about youth sports. Her son was one of her family invited me in to let me learn what it was like to be the family, a victim family of a man who chose to take advantage of their family and their son. And the idea that she's on with us today, that means the world to me. Marian, I love you, and I love Adrian, and I'm so proud of him and all that he's achieved in the years since.
Thank you, Marian, for joining us, and I'm so glad that we got to give a shout out to the families of the survivors that you work with. And folks, earlier in this conversation, Don, and the work that he did to help expose the child abusers in the sporting system in America, especially in high school and in youth sports. And then one of the things that came of this was that 31 states changed their approach to dealing with this kind of abuse. And you should be so proud of it, Don, and what you've been able to do. Folks, we're almost out of time with Don, but what we're going to do is give him a chance to catch his breath. And we are going to come back in a moment after some housekeeping to talk to Don about some closing thoughts, and also to give us a pro tip for writers that you will all find interesting and useful, even if you're not going to be a writer yourself. You're all consumers of writing, of course. And at 10 o'clock, as soon as we're off the air, this will run in all the channels that we're on: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn, as well as our digimentors.group website. So thank you, Don, and please stand by. Hi, everybody. Neil's going to be joining me now, and we are going.
Sri, sorry, knocked out your audio again. We're going to have to take you off and add you back in. Not sure why Sri's audio gets knocked off. Hopefully, Sri, let's try that audio again. Do we have your audio? Sri's going to see whether we can get his audio back. While he's figuring that out, again, I want to just give a quick shout out to our production team. Of course, Sri is the host. I am the executive producer and occasional guest host. Paula Kiger is our producer on Facebook and LinkedIn. She does an incredible job sharing links to articles and other coverage that we're talking about during the show. And if you saw earlier, she found that nonprofit that Don's friend was running in Nashville. The show is produced by Digimentors. We produce high quality virtual and hybrid events for organizations big and small around the world. We do hybrid and virtual events, social and digital consulting, training, and workshops. If you're interested in working with us, please give us a shout. You can contact Sri at digimentors.group, or you can email me, Neil at digimentors.group, and we'll get back to you. We're seeing a lot of folks moving from just virtual events into hybrid events, and we have quite a lot of experience in doing that. We're also doing a lot of social media audits. We're helping nonprofits and others recruit for communications positions. So let us know if we can help you with any of that. We also want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Muckrack. They're longtime supporters of Sri's work and of the New York Times Read Along. Thank you of course, to Muckrack. And we also want to give a shout out to our next guest. Next week, we're going to be joined by Dr. Olajide Williams, the founder and board chair of Hip Hop Public Health. He's the chief of staff of the Department of Neurology at Columbia University, and a global leader in health disparities. So it should be a very interesting show, and we certainly look forward to having him. He's going to offer a very different perspective on the work that we're doing. And finally, we want to talk about the Local Connection newsletter. The Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University brings you the Local Connection newsletter. Each week, it offers story ideas and pro tips for journalists. Best of all, it's free. You can subscribe at bit.ly/local news tips, bit.ly/local news tips. And when we bring Don back on, we're going to be asking him for a pro tip to share with our viewers. So with that, we'll bring, hopefully we'll get Sri's audio back. Sri, your audio?
I hope
Great.
It's working. And thank you, everybody, for watching and your support. Let's bring Don back on.
Absolutely. Don, thank you again for such a great show. We really appreciate it, and appreciate you taking the time with us on a Sunday morning. So if you can leave us with some final thoughts, that would be great.
Well, thank you, Neil. First off, the idea of being able to kind of cover all of these different areas in one little interview. Most interviews I do are about any one segment of that. So the idea that we get to cover the waterfront was really spectacular. But I know that one of the things you asked was for a pro tip for someone, and we talked about the idea of how to get an interview, and that is a challenge in times. So one of the things that I shared with you and that I wanted to mention is how much research we do even before the request to get an interview. And this is especially true even in our podcast. Think about it. We're going for C-level executives. We're asking Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta, or Bob Chapek, CEO of Disney, Dan Cathy at Chick-fil-A. And so what we know to be true is that the more research you do in advance, everybody usually waits to do their research after they've achieved or secured the interview. We do so much research in advance, and we include that research in the request. I mean, here's one of the guys that we had with all kinds of yearbook photos on this guest, and that we sent him in advance. The idea of doing that is that we want the guest request to arrive and have them look at it and say, or the interview request arrive and have them say, my gosh, if they've done that much work before I've even said yes, imagine how great it's going to be once we get into the conversation. So we have an amazing intern team that helps us do, and we use interns really aggressively in our organization. We have an amazing intern team. They all know exactly how to dig and find these little nuggets that allow us to connect to those we're asking for interviews, and it changes the dynamic. Our rejection rate is far lower because we've done the work in advance.
Great tip, and Chitachi also says that it's an excellent tip. So grateful for that. Before we let you go, we must mention the Savannah Bananas.
You can't even say that without smiling, right? I mean, honestly. So yes, it's a minor league baseball team, international league baseball team in Savannah, Georgia, in which the owner, when he bought the team, he made a commitment that he wanted to bring fun back to baseball. He wanted to change the dynamic of the way the fan experienced the game, because fans have lost touch with baseball. And so last year I was engaged to write a book with the owner and with the team, looking at how they are reimagining the game. And I have to tell you, there's nothing like it. And so when I told Neil that I was doing this, Neil broke out with all of his Savannah Banana knowledge. And so we were excited about bringing that story to life here next year.
Congratulations on getting that opportunity to tell a story that baseball really needs to pay attention to. They're doing something right down there. I learned about them on a ESPN Daily podcast with Pablo Torre, and it was very, very interesting, and they're having fun.
This coming Friday night, ESPN will actually have a crew in Little Savannah, Georgia, at their little stadium, broadcasting live a Savannah Bananas game on ESPN2.
Amazing.
It is very interesting. I do want to see if we can pull up just a little bit, just to give people a sense of what they do in games, because it is pretty interesting. It's a fun take. They have people dancing on the base paths. They have people on stilts.
Not always, yeah.
Not always, but all different rules. It's people announcing themselves, walking up. It's certainly interesting. So, Don, I'm very jealous that you got to spend a lot of time with them, and you got to throw out a first pitch as well at one of the games, right?
Not yet, but that is.
Oh, it didn't happen. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So that is that's in discussion. But actually, they don't throw out a first pitch. They throw out a first banana. Yeah.
Exactly.
Baseball is far too boring.
And people, as you know, some celebrities do a terrible job with the first pitch, so you can't do worse than the banana.
I've torn up an entire stalk of bananas preparing. So
we just want to thank our folks who are watching here. Jeanette is saying, let's see here, shout out to Savannah Gallagher for our podcast producer who runs our amazing internship team. Thank you. And thank you, Jeanette, for all your help with this. And you can give a shout out there, Don.
Well, it's Jeanette. Actually, I work for Jeanette. She's my wife.
Oh.
and wine connoisseur, I understand.
And wine connoisseur, exactly.
And Patricia says, thank you to the entire New York Times Read Along team. Awesome episode. And we had Camille watching and says, good morning, Mr. Don. Shared. And everybody, please hit share so your friends can watch. We're going to go off the air in just a minute, and they can watch and tag a friend. And I want to give a shout out to Neil's mom, who's watching. Sudha Parik's watching for Fort Lee, New Jersey. Thank you very much for your support of the show.
Hi, Mom.
Yeah. And with that, we'll say goodbye. We're excited for next week's show with Dr. Uday Williams of Hip Hop Public Health.
I think we'll just end with this one from Marion. Don is an amazing man and a great person, and her family thinks highly of him. Please go out on Facebook. You'll be amazed by his work. A great way to end it. Thank you. And as Sri mentioned, next week, Dr. Uday Williams. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
DonYaeger.com.